Congressman Schiff, we have this breaking news report tonight from the Washington Post indicating that President Trump has known since January 6th, 2017, the New York Times report tonight, that the president was briefed in real specifics about how Vladimir Putin specifically ordered the invasion, the attack on our election, and that Donald Trump has known this for a couple of weeks before he was inaugurated.
Lawrence, I'm not permitted to comment specifically on what the president was briefed and when he was given the briefing. But I can say this, as a member of the Gang of Eight, I was certainly kept abreast of what the Russians were doing in real time during the election. I continued to get briefings after the election during the period in which Donald Trump was then the president-elect. And it's not just the Gang of Eight members. The major presidential candidates are going to get a briefing on certain intelligence. When they become the president-elect, they're going to be given much more specific intelligence, and certainly when they become president, those briefings are going to continue. There is no way to claim that the president was unaware from the very beginning of what the Russians were doing and even specific evidence of what the Russians were doing. We indulge ourselves in this fiction somehow that maybe this is a problem of Donald Trump not knowing. But clearly he has been briefed time and time and time again. I would argue beginning as the Republican nominee until the President Day, he just can't accept it. And therein lies the real problem.
And, Congressman, it seems that the problem for the president in his strategy is that he wants to call the investigation that you've engaged in a witch hunt. He especially wants to call the special prosecutor's investigation a witch hunt. But it can't be a witch hunt if the Russians actually did attack our election processes.
Well, that's exactly right. You know, it's hard to escape the conclusion that there's some pathology at work here, because, of course, he could have said, yes, the Russians did it. I acknowledge the Russians did it. But nonetheless, I don't believe it was determinative in the impact on the election. Even if it were, I deplore it, et cetera. He could have said all of that. All of that actually would have been in his self-interest. But he's incapable of doing that. And the problem for our country is that means the President of the United States will not, cannot, is incapable of accepting that the Russians interfered, that the Russians are likely to interfere again, that he has a responsibility to the country to do something to protect ourselves in the next election, and this just isn't happening.
And Congressman, tonight's news seems to put all the more pressure on an idea that has been advanced by some Democratic senators and some Democratic members of the House, that the interpreter who was present in the room with President Trump and President Putin should reveal her notes of that meeting and tell Congress in testimony everything that she can about what was said in that room.
And I fully support that. And I never thought I would support a step like that, frankly. There are policy reasons why a president should be able to have private conversations with foreign leaders, but not under these circumstances where the president demands that there be effectively no witnesses, where the president makes reference to commitments that were undertaken in that private meeting, where in the public setting he undercuts our national interests and our intelligence agencies, and we can only imagine what was said in private. Under these kind of exceptional circumstances where the President of the United States is affirmatively working against our own interests as a country, then yes, we have to pierce the veil of secrecy in that meeting, and we should haul in that interpreter and find out exactly what happened.
And isn't it customary for interpreters' notes in meetings like that to be delivered in a memcon, a memorandum of conversation, to the Secretary of State, and then also a copy to the archives? I mean, these notes in the past have found their way in that route and not considered things that need to be kept secret forever.
Well, I think that's exactly right, and these records really need to be preserved, and more than that, they need to be shared with Congress so that we can determine what further steps we need to take to protect the country, yes, from Russian intervention, but also from a president that is incapable of accepting what the Russians did and might do again. So I think that's truly called for under these circumstances. I can tell you this, Lawrence, the Russians would have no compunction about recording this and using anything he said against the President of the United States. I have to imagine that if our intelligence agencies asked the President whether they could similarly record what took place, the President would have said no. And I cannot imagine the intelligence community going forward with recording those conversations without the President's approval. So here, again, the President has given the Russians a unilateral advantage over our country.
And other intelligence experts have been saying today that they firmly believe that Vladimir Putin has a recording of what went on in that room. What does that mean for the President?
Well, I think what that means is I would fully expect that our intelligence community would have briefed the President in going into that private meeting that you have to fully expect the Russians are recording everything you say. Now, it's one thing to advise the President of this. It's another thing to expect him to actually act on that information. But the consequence is if the President should do or say something that is either at odds with what he said privately to Putin or just at odds with Russian interests to the degree that Putin decides he's going to let the President have it, then Putin is in the possession of recordings of exactly what was said and can release them. So it's more compromise for the Russians.
Congressman Adam Schiff gets tonight's last word. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, Congressman. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.